Some stories are so horrifying, so deeply unsettling, that they echo through history long after the names have been forgotten. This is one of those stories. Imagine this, a quiet Virginian farmhouse tucked away in the rolling hills of 1830s America. White clapboard siding, a red barn, chickens in the yard. To the casual eye, it's nothing more than a symbol of pastoral life. But beneath that very soil, beneath the floorboards of that house, something unspeakable festered for over 2 decades. In the spring of 1834, 47 children were discovered chained inside a hidden basement. Emaciated, terrified, and barely able to speak, these children whispered a single name through cracked lips: Mother Sullivan. They were from different places, different races, different languages. No one knew how they got there. But the records unearthed, buried in the Henrico County archives, revealed a network so vast, so sophisticated, and so monstrous that it rivaled anything our darkest imagination could conjure. This isn't just a tale of one wicked woman. It's a story of silence, of how a community ignored whispers, of how a system failed the most vulnerable, and of how evil hides not in shadows, but in plain sight, behind smiles and polite conversation. If you're brave enough to confront one of the most disturbing true crimes in early American history, stay with us. But be warned, what you're about to hear will stay with you long after this video ends. The farmhouse stood exactly where it always had, at the edge of a narrow dirt road that cut through the rolling hills of central Virginia. White clapboard walls, a sagging wrap-around porch, a red barn behind it, half swallowed by creeping vines. To anyone passing through Henrico County in the spring of 1834, the Sullivan property looked like 100 other farms scattered across the countryside. But nothing about that house was ordinary. The first sign came at dawn on April 8th, when Sheriff Benjamin Crawford rode up the drive with his deputy, Marcus Webb. Crawford had served this county for 15 years. He had dealt with land disputes, drunken brawls, livestock theft, even the occasional murder. But as his horse slowed in front of the Sullivan house, he felt something he couldn't explain. A tightening in his chest, a sense that the ground beneath him was wrong. The place was too quiet. No chickens scratched in the yard, no smoke rose from the chimney. Even the wind seemed to hesitate as it moved through the trees. Constance Sullivan opened the door before Crawford could knock. She was composed, neatly dressed, her dark hair pinned back with precision. She smiled as though she had been expecting them. "Sheriff Crawford, what a surprise this early." Her voice was calm, pleasant, the kind of voice that soothed nervous children and reassured anxious neighbors. It was the same voice that had been heard in church, at the general store, and during charity collections for nearly 20 years. Crawford introduced Deputy Webb and explained that there'd been reports, rumors really, about disturbances near the property. Children crying, sounds from the cellar. Constance laughed softly. "Oh my, people do let their imaginations run wild. Children cry, houses settle. You know how it is." She invited them inside. The parlor was clean but sparse, furniture polished to a dull shine, curtains drawn despite the early morning light. Crawford noticed something else immediately: the smell. Not rot, not filth, something worse. Stale air, damp stone, a scent like long-neglected cellars. They talked over coffee. Constance repeated what she had told the community for years. She and her husband Ezra had taken in orphaned children, distant relations, poor souls who needed care and time to recover from trauma. "Where are the children now?" Crawford asked. "In bed," she replied quickly. "They've been ill, fevers. I won't have them frightened by strangers." Her hands trembled as she lifted her cup. That was when Deputy Webb asked to use the privy. Constance stiffened. "It's just outside," Crawford said casually, watching her reaction. Webb stepped around the side of the house and stopped dead.
The cellar door wasn't like any root cellar he'd ever seen. 3 iron padlocks secured it, heavy chains looped through thick wooden handles. The wood around the locks was scarred, deep grooves gouged into it, as though fingernails had clawed desperately at the grain. Webb felt his stomach drop. He returned to the house slowly, keeping his face neutral. When he leaned close to Crawford and whispered what he'd seen, the sheriff's expression hardened. Crawford stood. "Mrs. Sullivan, we'll need to inspect the cellar." Constance's smile vanished. "There's no need for that," she said sharply. "It's dangerous down there. Old equipment, collapsing walls." Before Crawford could respond, a sound drifted up through the floorboards. A whimper, then another. Then, clear as daylight, a child's voice, thin and hoarse. "Please." The room went silent. Crawford drew his pistol, opened the door. Constance staggered back. "I can explain. Now." When she didn't move, Crawford nodded to Webb. The deputy went outside and smashed the padlocks with the butt of his rifle. The chains fell away with a heavy clatter. The moment the door cracked open, the smell poured out. Human waste, mold, blood, and beneath it all, a suffocating sense of fear. Crawford descended first, lantern in hand. The basement was enormous. It extended far beyond the house above, branching into multiple chambers carved into the earth. Stone walls were mortared thick and sealed tight, soundproofed, and lining those walls, children, 47 of them. They were chained to iron rings embedded in the stone, ankles shackled, chains long enough to sit, to lie down, but never to run. Some were so small they looked no older than 6. Others were teenagers, their faces hollow, eyes sunken deep into skulls too large for their emaciated bodies. None of them spoke. They just stared. Crawford felt his knees weaken. Webb dropped the lantern and vomited. It took nearly an hour to free the children. Some couldn't stand. Some screamed when the chains were removed. Others clung to the walls, sobbing silently, terrified that freedom was another trick. One girl, maybe 13, clutched Crawford's coat sleeve. She said we belonged to her, Mother Sullivan. As the officers searched deeper, they found more rooms. A punishment chamber with stocks and restraints, a crude medical space with blood-stained cloths and bottles of sedatives, and finally, a narrow crawl space leading to something far worse, a burial chamber. At least 36 shallow graves lay beneath the packed dirt floor. Some bodies were small, some wrapped in rags. Lime had been spread over them to control the smell. Crawford stood in that room for a long time, unable to speak. Above ground, Constance Sullivan had collapsed into a chair. When confronted with what lay beneath her house, she didn't scream, she didn't deny it. She only said quietly, "They would have died out there." Ezra Sullivan was found in the barn later that day, trying to flee with cash and documents stuffed into a saddlebag. The news spread through Millbrook by sunset. Neighbors gathered in stunned silence outside the property. Mothers clutched their children. Men who had known the Sullivans for decades stared at the house as if seeing it for the first time. "How could this happen here?" someone whispered. The answer would take months to uncover. Records found in the basement showed names, dates, places. Children brought from Pennsylvania, Maryland, North Carolina, some purchased from corrupt orphanages, others kidnapped outright. Many marked with notes like uncooperative, weak constitution, expired. The oldest entries dated back to 1812. For over 20 years, this house had been a prison, and no one had known. Or worse, no one had asked hard enough. As night fell, the children were taken away under guard. Doctors arrived, ministers prayed, journalists rode in from Richmond. The farmhouse stood empty again, but the ground beneath it would never be silent, because this was only the beginning. What lay beneath the Sullivan home was not just a crime, it was a system, a network, a deliberate machine built on suffering. And as investigators would soon learn, Constance Sullivan had not acted alone.
The cellar door did not open easily. It resisted like something alive,
Wood swollen with age, iron warped by dampness, chains biting deep into the grain. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford put his shoulder into it, the metal groaning in protest. When it finally gave way, the sound echoed unnaturally, as if the house itself were exhaling after years of holding its breath. The stairs descended sharply into darkness. Deputy Marcus Webb lifted his lantern first. The light crawled downward, revealing stone steps slick with moisture, walls carved rough and uneven, and a ceiling far lower than any ordinary cellar. The air that rose to meet them was warm and suffocating, heavy with decay and human waste. Crawford would later say it felt like stepping into a wound that had been left to rot. At the bottom of the stairs, the lantern revealed the first set of iron rings bolted into the stone. Then the chains. Then the children. They were not screaming anymore. The sound had faded into something worse. Silence. 47 pairs of eyes stared back at the light, wide and unblinking, as if unsure whether this was rescue or another cruelty disguised as hope. Some tried to stand and failed. Others shrank back instinctively, pressing themselves against the walls as far as their chains allowed. Their bodies were thin to the point of distortion, limbs too long, joints too sharp. Many wore nothing but ragged shirts, stiff with grime. Several were barefoot, their feet cracked and bleeding from years on cold stone. One boy, no older than 6, whispered a single word. "Mother?" Deputy Webb turned away, retching. Sheriff Crawford stood frozen, his hand still gripping the lantern handle, his knuckles white. In 15 years of law enforcement, he had seen murder, cruelty, and desperation. But this was different. This was engineered, planned, sustained. This was not an act of passion. It was a system. As they moved deeper into the cellar, the scale of it became clearer. The basement extended far beyond the footprint of the farmhouse above, branching into multiple chambers, separated by thick stone walls. The architecture was deliberate, designed to trap sound, restrict movement, and isolate groups of children from one another. In one chamber, younger children were held together, their chains shorter, their movements more limited. In another, older children, teenagers mostly, were shackled farther apart, enough to work, to lift, to carry. And they had worked. Buckets sat in corners, used for waste. Crude wooden troughs held scraps of food, cornmeal paste, sometimes beans, occasionally meat if someone had earned it. The walls bore scratch marks, tally lines, and faint drawings etched with fingernails or bits of stone. Names, faces, sun shapes, houses. Things children remembered from a life before. Crawford ordered Webb to ride back to town immediately, no stops, no delays. He wanted doctors, wagons, clergy, anyone who could help brought back at once. Webb hesitated, unwilling to leave the children alone again, but Crawford insisted. As Webb climbed the stairs, the sound returned. Not screaming, crying. Low, exhausted sobs, as if the realization that someone had finally seen them was more overwhelming than the years of pain that came before. When help arrived hours later, the farmhouse became a scene of controlled chaos. Doctors from surrounding counties examined the children one by one. Many were severely malnourished. Several suffered from untreated infections, broken bones that had healed incorrectly, and respiratory illnesses from years of damp confinement. But what struck the physicians most was the uniformity of fear. The children flinched at raised voices. They avoided eye contact. Many refused food at first, as if convinced it was a trick. Others refused to speak at all. And almost all of them referred to Constance Sullivan the same way. Mother. Not with affection, with obedience. Constance herself had not resisted arrest. When deputies placed her in irons, she did not scream or beg. She did not cry. She simply straightened her dress, lifted her chin, and said calmly, "You're making a terrible mistake." Ezra Sullivan was less composed. He collapsed when they dragged him from the house, sobbing uncontrollably, muttering prayers and apologies that no one could understand. Later testimony would reveal that Ezra had been both enforcer and builder, the hands behind the walls, the chains, the punishments, but never the architect. That role belonged entirely to Constance. As investigators began cataloging the cellar, they found proof of how long this had been going on. Ledgers, carefully kept, bound in leather, hidden behind a false wall near the rear chamber. Each page listed names, some real, some replaced by initials, ages, physical condition, dates of arrival, notes on behavior, defiant, quiet, suitable, problematic. The earliest entry was dated 1812, 22 years before discovery. According to the records, more than 90 children had passed through the cellar. Only 47 were alive. The others were accounted for in a different section of the basement, one that even the hardened deputies struggled to enter. A narrow passage led to a chamber where the floor had been dug up and resealed repeatedly. Beneath it lay shallow graves, small skeletons wrapped in rotted cloth. Some bore signs of illness, others showed unmistakable trauma, fractured skulls, broken ribs, wrists twisted at unnatural angles. These children had not all died quietly. The realization hit the investigators with crushing force. The Sullivan cellar was not just a prison, a filtration point. Children came in, some survived, some were moved on, others were disposed of. As news spread, the town of Millbrook unraveled. Neighbors who had known the Sullivans for decades refused to believe it at first. They gathered in hushed clusters, shaking their heads, insisting there must be some explanation, that Constance was ill, that Ezra acted alone, that it couldn't possibly be as bad as people were saying. Then they saw the children, thin figures wrapped in blankets, loaded gently into wagons, blank stares, scars, the way they recoiled when anyone reached out too quickly. The illusion collapsed. Thomas Henderson locked his store early that night and sat alone in the dark, replaying every interaction he had ever had with Constance Sullivan, the ledgers, the cash, the calm smile. He realized with horror that he had helped feed the cellar. Dr. Whitfield was inconsolable. He admitted under oath that Constance always knew exactly which medicines to request: sedatives, fever reducers, treatments for malnutrition. She hadn't been guessing. She had been managing inventory. Reverend Matthews stood before his congregation the following Sunday and wept openly. He spoke of sin, of blindness, of the danger of mistaking appearances for virtue. Half the pews were empty. No one wanted to sit with their thoughts. As the children were relocated to temporary shelters under guard, investigators focused on one urgent question: where did the others go? The ledgers offered clues. Certain names were marked with dates and symbols, circles, slashes, numbers. Cross-referencing these entries with missing children reports from other counties revealed a disturbing pattern. Some children were transferred, sold. Correspondence found in Constance's study confirmed it. Letters written in coded language referenced deliveries, placements, and quality concerns. Payments were logged meticulously. Amounts varied by age, health, and temperament. This was not random cruelty. It was commerce. And the Sullivan farmhouse was only one node in a much larger network. Among the surviving children, one stood apart. Her name was Rebecca. She was 14, though she looked younger. Unlike the others, her eyes followed everything. She watched the investigators. She listened. When she spoke, it was quietly, but with precision. Rebecca had been in the cellar for 5 years. She remembered faces, names, voices, and she remembered visitors. Men who came in carriages, men who never went downstairs but spoke to Constance in the parlor, men who inspected certain children brought up briefly, cleaned, fed, and instructed to stand still and say nothing. Rebecca remembered where they went afterwards. They didn't come back.
she said simply. Her testimony would become the key that unlocked everything that followed. But for now, the town of Millbrook stood on the edge of a realization far larger than one monstrous household. The horror beneath the Sullivan farmhouse had been hidden not just by secrecy alone, but by politeness, trust, and the assumption that evil always announces itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, and by the time you hear it clearly, it's already been there for years.
For the first 2 days after the cellar was opened, the children said almost nothing. Doctors, clergy, and deputies moved among them gently, asking names, ages, places of origin. Most of the children stared blankly, eyes fixed on the walls or the floor. Some flinched at raised voices. Others rocked back and forth as if still chained. A few clung to one another with desperate intensity, terrified of being separated again. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford quickly realized something was wrong, not just physically, but psychologically. These children had not merely been imprisoned, they had been conditioned. The first to speak was not the oldest, nor the strongest. It was a girl with hollow cheeks and a fractured front tooth, estimated to be around 14. She sat rigid on the edge of a cot at the temporary infirmary, hands folded tightly in her lap, repeating the same phrase over and over under her breath. Say only what is permitted. A nurse finally knelt in front of her and asked softly, "What is your name?" The girl hesitated, then whispered, "I was number 11. The room fell silent. The nurse tried again. "What did your mother call you before you came here?" The girl's eyes flickered, as if searching through a locked room in her mind. After nearly a minute, she said, barely audible, "I think I was called Rebecca." That single name broke something open. Once Rebecca spoke, others followed, not all at once, but like cracks spreading through ice. A boy who had been marked as number 23 revealed his real name was Daniel. He had been taken from a dockside market in Baltimore when he was 8. Another, Samuel, said he'd been sold by a poorhouse overseer in exchange for donations. A pair of sisters remembered being separated during intake, one sent to isolation for crying too loudly. Every story was different. The pattern was the same. The children described a process Constance Sullivan called the receiving. New arrivals were brought in through the side cellar door, always at night. Their clothes were taken. Their hair was cut. They were washed with freezing water and forced to kneel while Constance spoke. She told them their families were gone, dead, ashamed, or unwilling to keep them. She told them the outside world was cruel, that no one would want them back, that running away meant death. Then she gave them a choice. Obey, she said, and you will be fed. Disobey, and you will disappear. The children quickly learned what disappear meant. Rebecca described the first time she witnessed punishment. A boy named Elias had refused to stop speaking in his native German. He cried for his mother. He screamed when chained. For 2 days, Constance ignored him. On the third night, Ezra Sullivan came down with a lantern. They took Elias into the isolation chamber. No one saw him again. The next morning, the children were made to scrub a section of stone floor stained dark. After that, no one cried aloud. The system inside the basement relied on fear, but also reward. Children who complied were allowed slightly more food, sometimes a blanket, occasionally the privilege of sitting instead of kneeling during prayers. Older children were promoted to watchers, tasked with enforcing silence and reporting dissent. This wasn't accidental. Investigators later recognized it as an early form of forced hierarchy deliberately designed to fracture solidarity. The children weren't just prisoners, they were tools turned against one another. Medical professionals examining the survivors made a disturbing discovery.
Many of the children exhibited symptoms of identity erosion, a psychological state where personal history is replaced with assigned roles. Some genuinely believed they had been born in the cellar. Others insisted Constance was their true mother, despite evidence to the contrary. "She taught us who we were," one boy said flatly. "She said names before her didn't matter." Another child, no older than 10, asked a deputy, "If she's gone, who owns us now?" The question chilled everyone in the room. As the days passed, investigators began compiling timelines based on the children's accounts. They learned Constance kept meticulous routines: morning prayers before any food, silent labor, cleaning, sorting, carrying, recitations of rules, evening inspections, night discipline. The chapel room played a central role. Children were forced to kneel for hours, repeating phrases Constance had written herself. They weren't Bible verses, not exactly. They were distortions. Order is love. Silence is safety. Mother sees all. These phrases weren't religious. They were psychological shackles. The most harrowing testimonies involved the infants. Several older girls admitted babies were born in the basement. No records existed. No cries were allowed. Some infants were taken away within days. Others didn't survive. When asked where the bodies went, the girls pointed silently toward the burial chamber. One girl said, "She told us they were imperfect." Another said, "She said some seeds don't grow right." That word, seeds, appeared repeatedly. Investigators suspected Constance had developed her own vocabulary to distance herself from reality. Children were units, babies were growths, deaths were corrections. Language became a weapon. The children also spoke of visitors, men who came in carriages, men who never spoke directly to the children. They inspected teeth, limbs, height, compliance. The children described standing in lines while Constance spoke for them, describing strengths and weaknesses like livestock. Not all children were chosen. Those rejected often disappeared soon after. This aligned with ledger entries found upstairs, records of transfers and unsuitable stock. The implications were horrifying. Rebecca's testimony proved the most critical. She remembered names, places, dates. She recalled hearing Constance speak of Southern buyers and experiments. She remembered Ezra arguing once, saying they were taking on too many. Constance's reply, according to Rebecca, was chillingly calm. They are resources, and resources must be used. Rebecca had survived because she learned to listen, to remember, to wait. As word of the testimony spread, the town of Millbrook collapsed inward. Parents who had once dismissed rumors now wondered about children they'd seen briefly, then never again. Farmers recalled wagons arriving late at night. The Reverend stopped holding services. Guilt settled like ash. The children's voices had cracked something open, not just the case, but the conscience of an entire community. Physicians documented extensive trauma, night terrors, speech regression, involuntary obedience responses. One boy stood at attention whenever an adult entered the room. A girl asked permission before blinking. Healing would take years, if it came at all. But something remarkable happened. As Constance's influence faded, something else returned: choice. The children began helping one another remember names, songs, places. One night, Rebecca taught 3 younger children how to say their names aloud without fear. Another child sang a half-remembered lullaby in Irish. It was the first time many of them had heard music not associated with punishment. A nurse later wrote, "They were not just survivors, they were witnesses." Sheriff Crawford understood then what this case truly was: not just a crime scene, a silencing, and now, finally, a reckoning. The children had spoken, and their words would carry far beyond Millbrook, beyond Virginia, beyond the Sullivan farmhouse. They would expose a system that thrived on invisibility, and next, investigators would follow those words outward to the network that made the basement possible, toward the people who paid, toward the buyers, toward the truth that Constance Sullivan was never alone.
To understand how Constance Sullivan was able to hide 47 imprisoned children beneath her farmhouse for more than 20 years, investigators had to stop thinking like lawmen and start thinking like Constance herself. She did not rely on locks alone. She relied on people. More precisely, she relied on systems of trust, carefully cultivated and expertly manipulated, woven so tightly into the social fabric of Henrico County that no single thread could be pulled without unraveling the entire town. That was her web. Constance Sullivan was never invisible. That was her greatest advantage. She attended church when her health allowed, always seated near the back, dressed plainly, her head bowed in humility. She donated food to families in need, discreetly and without ceremony. She never raised her voice in public, never argued, never demanded attention. She listened, and people mistook that for kindness. Sheriff Crawford later admitted that in 2 decades of service, Constance Sullivan had never once appeared in his ledger as a person of interest, not for disputes, not for complaints, not even for gossip worth recording. He existed, he said later, exactly where the law stops looking. Her first line of protection was selective visibility. The children were never seen all at once, not in town, not at church, not in passing wagons. At most, one child would appear with her, clean, quiet, eyes downcast, enough to confirm the story of orphans, never enough to raise questions. When asked why the children didn't attend school, Constance explained that their education was irregular, that trauma made structure difficult. When pressed further, she cited scripture about patience and healing. No one wanted to argue with that. Her second layer was distributed responsibility. No single person ever knew too much. The carpenter who reinforced the cellar walls was hired for only one section. The blacksmith who forged the chains was told they were for livestock security. The apothecary who supplied sedatives believed he was treating sickly orphans. Each participant held a fragment of truth, never enough to see the whole. And if someone grew curious, they were gently distanced. Orders slowed, invitations stopped, the warmth cooled. Constance did not punish suspicion, she starved it. Inside the farmhouse, the web tightened further. The children themselves were turned into threads. Older children were elevated into helpers, given small privileges, extra soup, a candle for reading, a few minutes above ground. In exchange, they were expected to watch, report, and correct. The brilliance of the system was its cruelty. Children enforced the rules. Children became the jailers. One survivor described it later with devastating clarity. She didn't need to watch us all the time. She taught us to watch each other. Investigators eventually reconstructed the hierarchy. At the top was Constance, called Mother, never Mistress, never Mrs. Sullivan. The word mother blurred discipline into devotion, fear into obligation. Below her were the watchers, older children chosen for obedience rather than strength. Below them were the followers, and at the bottom the newcomers, who were deliberately isolated until they broke. Each level reinforced the next. No rebellion ever formed because unity was impossible. Faith played a crucial role. Constance did not invent faith. She weaponized it. The chapel room, described by multiple survivors, was not a place of worship, but indoctrination. Verses were recited out of order, meanings distorted, God framed as distant and indifferent. You were abandoned, Constance told them. I was sent. Punishments were framed as purification, hunger as humility, silence as virtue.
One phrase appeared again and again in testimony: "Pain teaches what love will not." It was written on the walls, on bowls, in the children's memories. Outside the house, the web extended into documentation. Constance kept meticulous records, not journals, but inventories. Each child had a designation, an arrival date, behavioral notes, not names, functions. Those records served two purposes: structure and contingency. If discovered, she could claim structure, responsibility, order, proof that she was not cruel but organized. That argument would have worked until the bodies were found. As authorities widened the investigation, they realized something deeply unsettling. Constance Sullivan did not operate in isolation. She corresponded with others, not openly, not frequently, but consistently. Letters recovered from her desk used coded language, deliveries, placements, excess stock. Names were abbreviated, locations implied. It was a network, and Henrico County was only one node. Some letters referenced unsuitable children, others referenced early loss. Investigators would later match these euphemisms to burial sites beneath the cellar floor. Constance did not see failure as tragedy. She saw it as waste management. Her husband, Ezra Sullivan, was not the architect, but he was the enforcer. Survivors described him as silent, heavy-handed, rarely speaking unless necessary. He maintained the cellar, repaired chains, removed bodies, but he deferred to Constance, always. One child said, he was the hand, she was the mind. Ezra's role explains why Constance survived so long. Men like Ezra were expected to be cruel. Women like Constance were trusted. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the web was how it adapted. When neighbors grew closer, Constance withdrew. When scrutiny increased, she reduced numbers. When children aged beyond usefulness, they were transferred or eliminated. The operation evolved with the environment, like a living organism. The raid in April 1834 did not just expose a crime, it exposed a philosophy. Constance Sullivan believed children were malleable resources, that identity could be erased, reshaped, rewritten, that fear could replace family, and for years she was right. Even after her arrest, the web did not collapse immediately. Some townspeople defended her, some claimed exaggeration, others blamed Ezra alone. Denial spread faster than truth, because to accept the truth meant accepting complicity. When Constance was questioned, she did not plead, she did not cry, she did not deny. According to court transcripts, her only response to the charges was, "I kept what no one else wanted." That sentence haunted investigators because it wasn't entirely false. The final unraveling of the web came not from evidence, but from pattern. Across counties, across states. Children missing, farms isolated, women revered, men invisible. Mother figures, charitable facades, basements. Always basements. The Sullivan case forced authorities to confront an unbearable reality. This was not an anomaly, it was a model. One that thrived on trust, faith, and silence. One that could exist anywhere people chose comfort over curiosity. By the time Constance Sullivan died in custody under mysterious circumstances, the web had already torn itself apart. But the damage remained. The children carried it in their bones, the town carried it in its shame, and the nation carried it forward in laws written too late for the dead. Because Mother Sullivan did not just imprison children, she proved how easily evil could disguise itself as virtue and how long it could survive when no one dared to look too closely.
The web didn't begin in the cellar. It reached far beyond the Sullivan farmhouse, into towns, cities, state lines.
into halls of power, and into rooms where doors were always kept shut. And when the authorities finally began to tug at the threads left behind, they found something no one had expected. It wasn't just a monster. It was a network. The first real evidence came from a half-burned ledger found in the house's fireplace, salvaged just minutes before it turned to ash. It contained only a handful of pages, but what it revealed was staggering. Payment notations, names with initials and symbols matching those carved into the children's wooden bowls. There were receipts, notes about deliveries and removals, even crude maps showing backroad routes from Virginia into the Carolinas, Georgia, and further south. Each path marked with dates and coded references like M10 compliant or T3 defective. Constance hadn't acted alone. She was a hub, and the spokes extended across the antebellum South. Crawford forwarded the documents to federal authorities. For the first time, U.S. Marshals became involved. The Sullivan case was no longer just a state matter. It was a federal scandal. But progress was slow. Powerful families like the Blackwoods had deep political ties. By the time marshals arrived in Savannah, the estate had been emptied, records burned, staff dismissed. The elder Blackwood had vanished. Publicly, there was outrage. Privately, there was stonewalling. Witnesses refused to testify. A judge in Georgia mysteriously recused himself, and several children who had been relocated from Thorn Hollow vanished from their foster homes under unexplained circumstances. Someone was still protecting the network. But then came the break. A whistleblower. A former apprentice named Thomas Wexler came forward, terrified but willing to speak. He had worked at a small medical academy in Charleston, known for accepting unclaimed children as research subjects. Wexler had seen ledgers, watched experiments, and even attended a presentation where one child from Thorn Hollow, unmistakably Tobias, had been shown to a room full of academics. This was never about care. It was about control, about turning people into property without the paperwork. His words ignited a second investigation, this one into the medical trafficking ring that had operated parallel to the labor placements. Dozens of children were used in trials, others in behavioral studies. Many never left. The ring included doctors, professors, clergy, and it had operated mostly in secret for nearly 30 years. As more records emerged, one truth became painfully clear. The Sullivan basement was a prototype, a proof of concept. Constance Sullivan had built a model of subjugation so effective, so quiet, that it drew admirers from across the South. She was paid not just for the children, but for the methodology. Training manuals, chapel scripts, punishment schedules, a framework for creating silence. What she called in one surviving document, the doctrine of stillness. In a chilling journal entry, Constance had written, "Children are like clay. In light, they scatter. In darkness, they take shape. All they require is rhythm, control, and a firm hand." The investigators dubbed her system a cult, not of belief, but of design. Even after her arrest, pieces of the web kept surfacing. One plantation in South Carolina had a hidden chamber under a schoolhouse with similar iron rings. A small monastery in Mississippi was found with ledgers nearly identical to Constance's, minus the symbols. The Sullivan web was more than a crime scene. It was a blueprint others had followed. And many would never face justice, because by the time the world finally listened to the children, too many had already vanished. Too many graves remained unmarked. Too many names were never written down. But one thing became undeniable. Constance Sullivan had not been alone. She had been the teacher, the blueprint, the mother of something far more monstrous than anyone imagined. And what began in Thorn Hollow was only the beginning.
The courthouse in Richmond had seen its share of trials, but nothing like this. From the moment Constance Sullivan was escorted from her cell to stand trial, an air of quiet terror filled the courtroom. She appeared in a plain gray dress. her once carefully kept hair now streaked with white. But it wasn't her appearance that unnerved people. It was the calm. The way she stared at the spectators, unblinking, unbothered, as if she knew something they didn't. Federal marshals flanked her on both sides. Her lawyer, a reluctant appointee named Samuel DeWitt, had already tried twice to remove himself from the case, but the court refused. Someone had to defend her, even if no one wanted to. The charges were staggering. 47 counts of unlawful imprisonment, 19 counts of involuntary manslaughter, 8 counts of murder, federal conspiracy charges, racketeering, human trafficking, and accessory to crimes committed across at least 5 states. The evidence was overwhelming, but the nation demanded a trial. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, politicians, lawyers from distant states, even President Jackson's office had dispatched observers, and every day a silent row of seats was reserved for the surviving children. Rebecca sat among them, flanked by caretakers and trauma specialists. Her eyes never left Constance. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Josiah Merrick, spent the first 3 days just establishing scope. Maps, ledgers, testimonies. They showed the web. They named the buyers. They brought in federal agents who had raided Blackwood's estate. They played audio from recovered phonograph experiments conducted in the Charleston medical facilities. Then came the survivors. Rebecca testified first. She told the court about the cellar, the chains, the cold, the quiet rules. She recited the doctrine of stillness from memory. At one point, she stared directly at Constance and said, "You told us silence was the only way to be safe, but I was never safe, not once." Several jurors cried. Others followed. Elias's sister, who'd been rescued from a plantation in Alabama. A boy named Judah, who had been relocated through the Sullivan Ring and later escaped from a chemical testing facility in New Orleans. Each account reinforced the truth. This was no isolated case of abuse. It was systemic. Constance's defense strategy stunned everyone. Her lawyer, under her instruction, entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. But there was no breakdown, no erratic behavior. Constance herself calmly explained that she believed she had been following divine instruction, that God had told her to purify and preserve, that the children had been saved, not harmed. She called herself the shepherd. The courtroom gasped. "I never touched a whip," she said on the stand. "I never beat a child. I gave them order. I gave them structure. Before me, they were unwanted. After me, they were obedient. I made them useful." The judge struck half her testimony for being irrelevant, but the jury had heard enough. The trial lasted 4 weeks. In the end, the verdict was unanimous on all charges. Guilty. Sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was scheduled for 6 months later to allow time for federal appeals, but Constance didn't wait. On the morning of June 9th, just 8 weeks after the verdict, a prison guard named Holden Dunbar found her hanging from a bedsheet tied to the barred window in her cell. A single candle had been lit on the floor beneath her, and carved into the wall in crude script were the words, "Silence is stillness. Stillness is peace." The news of her death spread quickly. Some celebrated, others mourned the lack of justice. Without Constance alive, the chance to uncover deeper connections died with her. No final testimony, no further confessions. But the children, those who had survived, felt something else. Relief. Rebecca, when told the news, simply whispered, "She won't speak again." An autopsy confirmed suicide, but rumors lingered, that someone within the prison helped her, that powerful men wanted her silenced permanently. The warden denied everything, but 2 guards were quietly dismissed in the following weeks. The mystery of her death became part of the Sullivan mythos. Some called it justice, others called it a cover-up. A few whispered that Constance never died at all, that the body was someone else, a switch, a fabrication. There were no photos, no public viewing, just a sealed casket buried on an unmarked grave on state grounds. But the case didn't end there.
In the aftermath of Constance's death, federal investigators released thousands of pages of case files, transcripts, receipts, testimonies. They became the foundation for sweeping reforms in child protection laws, orphanage oversight, and interstate trafficking enforcement. The Sullivan Doctrine, once a hidden manual of manipulation, was now dissected in legal courses and criminal psychology programs. Constance Sullivan had become a case study in control, a name invoked alongside the worst criminals in American history, and her trial, though cut short, sparked a nationwide reckoning with the hidden horrors of so-called benevolent institutions. But for the children who had lived beneath her house, justice had always been about more than a verdict. It was about being heard. It was about someone finally listening. And in that courtroom, in that brief window before the silence returned, they had spoken, and the world had listened.
They found the first grave behind the old smokehouse, nearly a month after Constance Sullivan's death. It had been a cold winter. The ground, hardened by frost, was reluctant to yield its secrets, but the thaw brought moisture, and with it a subtle sinking in the earth. A patch of soil near the rotting timbers of the smokehouse sank unevenly, drawing the attention of a maintenance crew hired to begin the long-delayed demolition of the Sullivan property. What they uncovered was not one grave, but 3. Each was shallow, each bore the bones of a child, and none of them matched the 47 children rescued. This discovery shattered what fragile closure the town of Millbrook had begun to build. If there were more children, more victims, then how many had they missed? How many had vanished without record, without memory, without name? Sheriff Benjamin Crawford returned to the property that same evening, boots sinking into thawed mud as he stared at the churned-up ground. "We thought we'd seen the worst of it," he told the diggers. "We were wrong." A forensic team, assembled hastily by federal marshals, began a systematic excavation of the grounds surrounding the Sullivan farm. They started with the obvious places: the barn, the perimeter of the cellar, and the dense pine grove to the east. Each location yielded more remains: bones, torn scraps of clothing, child-sized shoes. By the end of the second week, they had found 17 separate burial sites, and not a single grave bore a marker. The children had been buried anonymously, stripped of identity, some wrapped in burlap, others naked and curled in fetal positions. One grave, containing the remains of 2 small girls, had been layered with lime, an old trick used to slow decay and mask smell. Crawford stood over that grave, jaw clenched. "She knew what she was doing," he whispered. The community, once unified in shock, began to fracture. Some couldn't bear to know more. They shut their doors, moved away, refused to speak to journalists or visitors. Others demanded accountability. Why had no one noticed these graves before? Why had Constance's neighbors, good, God-fearing people, never questioned the strange activity on her land? Guilt spread like fog, and with it, fear. Because the truth was now undeniable. There were more victims than anyone had imagined. Federal authorities brought in ground-penetrating radar, dogs trained to detect human remains. Volunteers combed old town records, searching for missing children, orphan lists, and any discrepancies in the census. Rebecca, now under protection and housed with a recovery family in Pennsylvania, was shown photos of recovered items: shoes, wooden toys, tattered clothing. She identified 2. "Jacob's," she said, pointing to a weathered wool cap, "and that one, that's Lucy's ribbon." Neither Jacob nor Lucy had been among the 47 survivors. The press dubbed it the Millbrook Mass Grave. Headlines blared across the country. But not all of the nation was eager to listen. In Richmond and Charleston, prominent figures dismissed the findings as sensationalist. A few even suggested the graves had predated the Sullivans, burials from an older epidemic or an unrelated tragedy.
These theories were disproved quickly. Among the recovered artifacts were handmade name tags stitched into the linings of clothing, names that matched letters found in Constance's ledger. One read, Edgar, arrived 1832. He never left. As weeks passed, the true scale of the horror emerged. By spring, a total of 38 graves had been uncovered. That brought the suspected total of victims to at least 85. Some graves contained multiple bodies, some held only partial remains, evidence of dismemberment according to the coroner. A few were found beyond the farm's boundaries, in the woods or near abandoned wells. The children had not all died at once. The ages of the remains varied, spanning over 2 decades, and in nearly every case, the cause of death was either starvation, infection, or blunt force trauma. A memorial committee was formed in Henrico County. Survivors, neighbors, and distant relatives of missing children gathered at the site, now cordoned off with government fencing. Crosses were planted. Names were spoken aloud, even when no body had been matched. But something felt incomplete, because there were no pictures, no documents, no family photos to match to the tiny skeletons in the ground. These weren't just graves, they were erasures, whole lives scrubbed from the world. Sheriff Crawford, now aged beyond his years, took it upon himself to create what he called the Book of the Forgotten. He hired an artist to sketch each child recovered. Based on size, estimated age, and context, each child was given a placeholder name: Willow, Tommy, Rose. He wrote beneath each, "This child was found. This child lived." The book became a traveling exhibit shown at schools and churches. Some called it exploitative, others called it necessary, because history left unchecked has a way of repeating itself. Among the documents found in the Sullivan basement was a list, a long one. Nearly 100 names, coded but decipherable. Of those, fewer than 60 had been accounted for, either among the rescued or the dead. That meant 40 children were still unaccounted for. Gone. Vanished. Sheriff Crawford refused to close the case. Even after he retired, he kept his wall of photos and maps pinned with string and scribbled with questions. Somewhere out there, he said, our graves were yet to find, and stories were yet to honor. In 1841, 7 years after the discovery, a boy in Alabama stumbled upon a small wooden box buried in the corner of a cotton field. Inside were 2 child-sized skulls. Nearby, an old rusted chain. Authorities later confirmed that the plantation had ties to the Sullivan correspondence. The graves were connected. So were others, one in North Carolina, another in Mississippi. The network Constance helped build left fingerprints across the South. And beneath those fingerprints, children, lives, forgotten but not lost. Not anymore.
By the time the final investigation reports were filed and the last shallow grave was documented, the United States had already begun to forget the faces of the children whose lives were stolen. The trial of Constance Sullivan and the ensuing crackdown on her co-conspirators had briefly ignited national outrage. But as with so many tragedies, public attention shifted, eclipsed by war, by politics, by the next scandal. Yet, for those who had seen the Sullivan basement with their own eyes, who had walked the long, musty halls beneath the farmhouse and stared into the hollowed faces of its survivors, forgetting was never an option. The echoes of what had happened in Thorn Hollow lingered, unspoken, unresolved. And in those echoes, investigators, journalists, and survivors alike began to uncover something even deeper than a network or a conspiracy. They found silence itself, a silence shaped, maintained, and handed down. This chapter is about that silence, about what it meant, about how it shaped the lives of those who endured, those who witnessed, and those who turned away, and how, in time, it began to speak. The first documented attempt to tell the full story of the Sullivan case in public came from a young teacher named Elizabeth Crane. In 1842, nearly 8 years after the basement was uncovered, she self-published a collection of essays titled The Innocents Below. Elizabeth had grown up near Millbrook. She had seen the Sullivan family wagon in town as a child and remembered the rumors that had swirled in the wake of the arrests. When she became a schoolteacher in Richmond, she dedicated her spare time to tracking the surviving children. She found 8. They were scattered across 3 states, living in orphanages, poorhouses, and, in one case, a small Quaker-run boarding school. All of them bore scars, some visible, many not, and none of them wanted to talk about what had happened. "They have forgotten how to speak of it," Elizabeth wrote, "or perhaps we have simply forgotten how to ask." Her essays blended fact and reflection. She documented what little she could find in court records and tried to humanize the victims through short portraits and imagined monologues. The book sold only a few dozen copies in her lifetime. It would take more than a century for it to be recognized as the first serious attempt to center the voices of the children. That silence, the one Elizabeth described, was not just personal, it was structural. In state archives, the Sullivan case file sat locked in a special section marked sensitive. Survivors' names were redacted. Whole pages were missing. Attempts by journalists to access the case throughout the late 1800s were denied, citing public decency and family reputations. The official history of Henrico County, published in 1898, mentioned Constance Sullivan only once, in a footnote. A certain controversy surrounding an orphan asylum near Millbrook brought temporary attention to the region. It is no longer considered a significant historical event. Generations of Virginians grew up unaware of the crime that had defined their grandparents' era. The Sullivan farmhouse was gone, demolished in 1845. A tobacco field grew where the cellar had once stood. No historical marker was ever placed. But silence, like a pressure cooker, builds tension over time, and eventually something has to give. It began with Rebecca. By the time she was in her 60s, Rebecca Hartwell, born Rebecca Wren, had built a quiet life as a seamstress in Pennsylvania. She had a husband, children, and a small white house with blue shutters. She was known in her town for her skill with lacework and her unusual hush. She rarely raised her voice, never interrupted, and never spoke of her past. Until one autumn morning in 1887, when she wrote a letter to a local journalist named Edwin Price. The letter was simple, written in a careful, looping script. "You once printed a story about a girl found in a basement in Henrico County. I was that girl. If you'd like to know what we never told the court, come visit me. I don't have long." Edwin went. What followed were 12 hours of conversation over 2 days. Rebecca, now frail and confined to her porch, finally let her silence break. She described the punishments, the rewards, the hierarchy among the children. She explained how some children learned to police the others, becoming small enforcers to survive. She revealed that not all victims were passive, that some had turned cruel. She spoke of Elias, of the night he tried to lead them out, of how he was made to disappear. "I wasn't just a victim," she said. "I was also a bystander. We all were. We learned to stay quiet because silence was safer than hope." Edwin's article, titled "The Girl Who Remembers," was published in serialized form in the Pennsylvania Register, and it reignited interest in the case across the country. By 1900, survivors were few, but they were no longer silent. John Marcus, once known as Subject 19, had become a carpenter in Maryland. He gave an interview to a Baltimore newspaper in 1902, where he described the layout of the basement with astonishing clarity. "The cellar was our world. I still dream about it. Sometimes I still wake up reaching for the bowl with the X. That was mine, the one she let me keep." Public interest surged.
Suddenly, libraries were receiving requests for records long buried. Activist groups called for a national registry of historical abuse cases, and a small collective of writers, led by Howard Tilden, published a detailed monograph in 1904 titled Stillness: The Psychology of Indoctrinated Silence. Tilden's theory was radical for the time, that trauma could be generational, that silence itself could be passed down. He interviewed descendants of Sullivan survivors. Many reported similar dreams, aversion to basements, unusual reactions to discipline. What had happened in Thorn Hollow, it seemed, didn't end in 1834. It echoed. And those echoes finally reached Congress. In 1911, Representative Clara Wentworth of Massachusetts introduced a resolution calling for a National Day of Remembrance for the Children of Silence. It failed, but not before stirring a national conversation about how America confronts its darkest histories. Wentworth, in her speech to the House, asked, "If we cannot bear to remember them, how can we claim to have learned from them?" By 1920, a small memorial was finally erected on the land where the Sullivan House once stood, a simple stone plaque surrounded by whitewashed fencing. It read, "Here stood the House of Silence, and beneath it, children forgotten. We remember them now." To this day, researchers continue to piece together the threads Constance Sullivan left behind. Her system, the doctrine of stillness, has become a case study in trauma psychology. Her ledgers, unearthed from a hidden safe in 1973, are studied in courses on the ethics of record-keeping. And the children? They have become more than names. They are voices. They are echoes. And finally, we are listening.
In the decades that followed the fall of the Sullivan Empire, one question loomed larger than all others. How had it lasted so long? Not just in bricks and chains, but in ideas, carefully planted, methodically nurtured, and passed down in whispers, written ledgers, and imitation. The Doctrine of Stillness, Constance Sullivan's handwritten guide for conditioning children into silence and submission, didn't vanish with her death. It mutated. And like a virus, it infected minds, institutions, and dark corners of society that preferred obedience over freedom. In 1852, nearly 15 years after the cellar was emptied and the last surviving child rescued from the Thorn Hollow farmhouse, another basement was discovered in Missouri, this time beneath a private school. Hidden behind a locked storeroom, investigators found crude chains affixed to wooden support beams and tattered bedding arranged in small squares. Scratched into the wood above one of the makeshift beds was a single word: Mother. By then, the legend of Constance Sullivan had evolved into something of an American folklore ghost story. She was the witch of Henrico Conti, the demon bride, the mourner of Thorn Hollow. Her name was evoked in whispers and warnings to children. But behind the folklore remained something far more chilling: documented reality. Academic institutions, law enforcement agencies, and emerging child protection groups began to study the Sullivan case, not just as a tragedy, but as a case study. A disturbing model in how control could be systematized, how vulnerable populations could be exploited under the guise of charity, and how communities could become complicit through inaction. The phrase Sullivan Standard emerged in early sociology texts to describe environments of normalized abuse cloaked in benevolence. In 1879, Harvard's fledgling Department of Criminal Psychology published a report titled Obedience Through Absence: Case Study in the Doctrine of Stillness. The paper argued that the techniques developed at the Sullivan farm were not merely acts of cruelty, but deliberate psychological engineering, long before modern psychology even had a name. The doctrine taught, isolation creates dependency, repetition replaces memory, fear cements hierarchy, naming creates identity, but removing names destroys it. These insights would later influence, not intentionally but insidiously, military conditioning studies, interrogation manuals, and worst of all, state-run orphanages.
The doctrine had died with Constance, but her methods lived on. In 1893, a second congressional hearing into child welfare abuses referenced the Sullivan case as a foundational moment in the development of modern protection services. Yet for all its horror, many of the key elements had resurfaced, under new names, in new forms. The mass relocation of indigenous children into reform schools, the illegal adoptions of poor and immigrant children, the use of institutional orphanages as labor pools, all echoed the same structure: remove the child from their world, strip their identity, replace it with obedience. In one of the most harrowing connections, researchers uncovered that several state-run asylums in the early 20th century had incorporated practices eerily similar to the Sullivan Doctrine: strict silence hours, reward and punishment cycles, use of surrogate mother figures who were both caretaker and enforcer. The blueprints had survived, not as a named doctrine, but as shadows of an idea too efficient to die. And yet, not all was darkness. Out of the ashes of Thorn Hollow came the country's first organized child advocacy network, the Rebecca Foundation, named for the girl whose testimony broke the case wide open. Founded in 1855 by Quaker abolitionists and surviving family members of the victims, the Foundation's mission was clear: to never allow another Sullivan era. They created the first private network for tracking children in state care. They pushed for national laws requiring registration of guardianship changes, and they successfully lobbied for what would become the Federal Child Protection Act of 1861. But most importantly, they documented. They wrote down names. They recorded testimonies. They gave the forgotten a voice, even when no one wanted to hear it. Modern historians still debate whether Constance Sullivan was a product of her time or an outlier, a singular evil mind. But most agree what she built could not have thrived without help. It required silence from her neighbors, cooperation from vendors, indifference from the law. And that is the true legacy of the doctrine: not that one woman created it, but that so many allowed it. Today, the site of Thorn Hollow is a protected memorial. The farmhouse is gone. In its place stands a garden, maintained by volunteers, where each of the 47 rescued children is represented by a white stone embedded in the soil. No names, because many were never known, but their memory is kept alive. Visitors often report an eerie stillness to the place, not threatening, but heavy, as though the land remembers. And perhaps it does, because silence was never absence, it was presence, a signal, a warning, a doctrine broken, but never fully erased. We still hear it in stories that resemble Thorn Hollow too closely, in institutions that echo the same patterns, in every child who disappears without question, and in the question we must keep asking: how many more Sullivans have we failed to see? The Sullivan case is no longer just a case, it's a lens, through which we must view every forgotten child, every sealed door, every silence that screams. If this darkness could thrive in plain sight, in quiet towns and respected homes, what else lies buried beneath the surface of history? You are the keeper of these forgotten voices. Subscribe to join a community that refuses to let the past stay buried. Like this video if you're brave enough to face the truths most turn away from. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were a neighbor of the Sullivan farmhouse? The doctrine may have been designed to silence, but you can choose to speak. We'll see you in the next chapter of America's hidden history. Until then, stay vigilant, stay questioning, stay loud.